Hi, Misha here, and today we return to talking about British armor, British tanks. And we're going to focus on the Mark.A medium tank, known as the Whippet. It was never officially called that, but that's what everyone calls it. And I also have the Mark IV here, because this is a new version of the model from Wings of the Great War, as is this one over here. And I have my Russian T-18 light tank here. And I'll explain why later on. But yeah, these are all 1/72 scale. The T-18 is die-cast. These are actually resin models, although they do have some metal, for example, the guns, so they won't break. Because while the Mark IV is kind of the production version of the Mark I, and over 1,000 were built, and it led to the improved Mark V, which over 400 were built, those were heavy tanks. The Whippet was the lightest tank that Britain really developed during World War I, classed as a medium tank. It was really for a different role. It wasn't meant to replace, it was meant to supplement the Mark IV and later Mark V. And England never really made a true light tank. The T-18 here is a derivative of the Renault FT from France, which was a true light tank, which saw use by many militaries for a long time, because over 3,000 were built. So yeah, we'll just talk about it. Like I said, this is a 1/72 scale model of a Mark IV tank from Wings of the Great War. This is a new one they just released in 2022, but they've done them in the past. And this one is actually one of the repurposed ones that Germany captured. And they actually had more British Mark IVs than they did the German-designed A7V, about double. And so they redeployed these quite a bit, sometimes putting German guns on them, also sometimes increasing the crew. But since this is a new model, I thought we would just show it for a minute while we talk. The Mark I was developed in 1915 and 1916, with William Trenton being one of its principal designers, engineers, developers. And while the Mark I itself, they would only build about 150, and the Mark II and Mark III were trials and testing and training versions, the Mark IV, they would build somewhere between 11 and 1,200. And it was a pretty successful design for a first-generation tank. Trying to get you a little bit more straight here. About 30 tons, so not light, and had a standard crew of 8, 4 of which were needed just to drive it, 4 would operate the guns. And the Mark IV was in 2 versions, male and female. The female had 5 .303 caliber machine guns. The male had 3 .303 caliber machine guns and 2 6-pounder guns, and this one has the 6-pounders here. So it was a pretty tanky tank, and it was designed to cross trenches and was effective enough, but the Mark IV only had a max speed of about 4 to 4.5 miles per hour, and the Mark V only had a max speed of about 5 miles per hour. They also had relatively limited ranges, anywhere from about 35 miles up to about 50 miles, depending on which version. And they were pretty claustrophobic inside, but they were first-generation tanks and had better success than what we saw in Germany, at least. This bar on the top is a ditching bar, so in case it could get stuck, they would throw it down and kind of use it to get a good grip on the ground and roll it over. They were either made from wood or steel-plated wood beam. But this is the primary tank when you think of Britain in World War I. But William Trenton, just as this was coming around in October of 1916, had the idea for a light tank to support the heavy tank. The idea was the heavy tank could knock down barbed wire, other fencing, it could tackle fortifications or heavy emplacements, it could punch a hole in the enemy's defenses and lines. But it was slow and not terribly maneuverable. So what about having a light tank to exploit those holes, those gaps, to kind of rush in and do some damage while it could? Basically to act like cavalry, if that makes sense. Rush in, go behind the enemy lines, harass, sow confusion, what have you. So in October he first had this notion. It was approved by the military in November and the government towards the end of the month, and already by December of 1916 they started building the prototype. Initially designated as the Trenton Chaser, the first pattern was to be about 8 tons and have a maximum speed of about 8 miles per hour, so nearly double that of the Mark I, Mark IV series. It would also carry more fuel for better endurance across the enemy's land, have a smaller crew, be cheaper and easier to mass produce, and they wanted it to have 2 engines, a few things like that. But work would go ahead, and eventually the design would grow, would morph to kind of meet the needs of the military. And they would experiment with a few different turret arrangements and gun arrangements really in early 1917. So let's get our German captured Mark IV off the spinny thing and now look at today's subject matter. This is the tank that would go into production, and there was really only one production version. Known officially as the medium tank Mark.A. And like I said, initially they tried to use the name Trenton Chaser, but it was actually William Trenton himself who kind of coined the name Whippet after the fast dog. This is what caught on, Whippet. And not just for this specific tank, but really for any lighter tank, I should say, that's actually quite fast. And so the Whippet name was applied to many different types of tank and other vehicles in World War I, and even some would continue to use it after the war. Now I will say, on this model, the tank treads are chipped, and here, that's the danger of being resin. The benefit of being resin, they can do lots of weird, unique variants, and they don't cost a ton, because setting up a casting for this would be pretty pricey. Anyway, I knew they were chipped when I bought it, so I bought it as a blim, but these have been out of print from Wings of the Great War for a long time, so I'll take a blim one over nothing at all. I'll probably try to paint them or something, but not too bad, especially when it's sitting on this little stand. It is what it is. Yeah, the design they initially went with. In February, they worked with a revolving turret. They even made one. They actually copied it from an armored car design. So it could have had that, but they decided to not pursue that. For what it's worth, the little Renault FT would eventually be the first production tank with a revolving turret. Other tanks that had turrets like Little Willie, it didn't move. It was kind of fixed. So still have to wait. Instead, they went for this fixed turret here with multiple guns pointing out. Instead of one gun that could rotate, they went with 4 guns pointing in different directions. Anyway, they began trials in early March of 2017, and very quickly the British Commander-in-Chief, General Haig, ordered 200 of these tanks to be built. And this order was confirmed in June of 2017 by the British government. France was also kind of involved in the whole procurement war strategy. And he really, really wanted the tanks to become available by August of 2017. And they would gear up to produce these at Foster's, who had made the Mark I and what have you. But it proved to be more daunting for mass production than they originally planned for. So it would not be until October that the first production tanks were ready, and the first two would not be handed over to the British military for field trials until December 14, 1917. And so the first tanks would not make their way to the British Expeditionary Force in France until early 1918, just kind of how it went. So what is the Whippet? Well, it's kind of an interesting little design. Some big benefits and some big drawbacks. It's about 14 tons, so yeah, very much medium, about half the weight of the Mark I, Mark IV, but about double the weight of our French FT, which is about 7 tons. It's about 20 feet long and has a crew of 3, driver, gunner, and commander. And like I said, this is a fixed turret. It's more of a box. The commander and the gunner would mostly be in it, although the commander does have a hatch to pop up and observe. We have 4 Hotchkiss Mark I 303 machine guns on ball mounts, and it typically carried about 5,400 rounds for them. These could be dismounted, and sometimes they were. 1 or 2 were even removed. And they could even be replaced in the field with other machine guns. For example, there are instances where Lewis guns were installed when a Hotchkiss was damaged. Just, what it was. They didn't really think about or want heavier guns like the 6-pounders on the Mark I, Mark IV, Mark V, because this was meant to roll in quickly and use its machine guns to just kind of sow discord. So a heavier gun really would not have been of a whole lot of use to Whippet. It actually has 2 engines, and they're taken from London buses, double-decker buses, so they're readily known gasoline engines. Each engine powers one of the 2 tracks. They are linked together in a certain way where if one engine goes out, the other can take over and power both tracks, but if so, it's a very limited horsepower, so the tank would have to crawl back. Better than nothing, but not much. On the other hand, this was fast for the day and time. It could get up to about 8.3 miles per hour. The idea, they needed it to be able to be about twice as fast as a running soldier, so it could outspeed a soldier, kind of keeping up with cavalry, although as it happened, it was still a bit slower than a person on horseback normally would be. It also had much better range. It carried standard about 70 gallons of fuel, which gave it a range of about 80 miles. Doesn't sound great today, but again, keeping in mind the earlier tanks, what they had. They would also often carry cans of fuel on the outside, which was kind of a double-edged sword if one of them got shot. But it could be filled up in the field if needed. So our driver sits in the front in this little kind of cubby. The whole fighting compartment's one room in the back here. Driver's on the right. And we have our 2 other guys in the turret region. And we have a door in the back to enter. Interestingly, the floor is wood, or at least predominantly wood. The armor was pretty typical for the day and time. It was right around 1/2 inch, sometimes slightly less, sometimes slightly more. So it was effective enough against splinters, fragments, and machine gun fire, but it could not take a hit from an anti-tank round or a larger gun. But the speed was hoped to make up for that. These were very cramped inside, and you only had the gunner supposed to man all 4 guns. That's why sometimes they were removed. Other times the commander would hop up and help them, but it was kind of hard to work around each other. Sometimes they even have a 4th crewman in there to operate the guns, but having 4 guys in here was not pleasant, so it was not done often. That's why they would sometimes remove 1 or 2 guns to make room. It kind of depended on the mission. It was also quite maneuverable for what it was, and it could cross trenches officially of about 8.5 feet, although in testing back in England, they found that it could cross up to 10 feet, and it was able to kind of go around or up and down through shell craters pretty good. Unlike the Mark I, Mark IV, which required 4 guys to drive it, this only required 1 guy. The downside was it was a very complicated thing to drive it, because you're having to control 2 engines plus brakes and everything else. Also on top of that, this suspension is not sprung at all, but then again, pretty much none of the World War I tanks were. The idea of a sprung suspension would come later. In fact, that's one of the key differences between the original FT and the Russian T-18. The T-18 would have some cushion for the suspension. So it was an interesting thing, and it really did complement the Mark IV quite well, making up for some of its shortcomings. But, yeah. Originally, by December of 1917, the order had increased from 200 to 400 of these, but then it was reduced back down to 200 because there were already better versions on the drawing board. The Mark B and C, but mainly the Mark D, which was actually a different tank, primarily designed by Wilson, that was to replace this, but in 1919, so obviously it never went into full production, leaving the Mark.A pretty much the only Whippet of note from World War I. So once it did finally make it to the front in the winter of 1918, well, how did it do? Well, when these first went over, they really didn't see much use, and they didn't see any combat in the beginning because, well, this is not a tank for a static war. It needed some movement to really exploit its advantages. That would come in March. The Germans would begin the spring offensive, and a lot of Allied troops were having to retreat and reorganize. So the Whippets were used to support and protect them at first. So not exactly what they were designed for, but they had their uses there. The first confirmed combat would come on March 26 for these tanks. And really, they would start to make a name for themselves beginning in April. On April 24, it was an eventful day for the Whippets. They would, a company of 7 would actually kind of get behind the Germans and penetrate their defenses, and are credited with killing up to 400 German soldiers. On the other hand, later that day, the first Whippet was not first, but was destroyed by a German A7V tank. This was only the second tank-on-tank battle of the war, and the first and really only time the Mark.A here would face an enemy tank directly. So, kind of a, yeah. But no, it was kind of the talk of the town in April and May. It was making a name for itself. By the summer, about 166 had been delivered. The remaining 34 would get delivered by late fall of 2018. Again, production was a little bit slow because it was a little more difficult than they kind of anticipated to build these. And in August, they would continue to make a name for themselves. several times, engaging the enemy. They would get behind enemy lines. Music box is a famous example. By the way, these all had individual serials beginning with A200 running up to A399, and many of them would get names by the crew. Music box is the one that went behind the lines. It started off with 6 other companions, so a company of 7, but its mates fell away. They either were damaged or broke down, so it found itself alone and way behind enemy lines and basically cut off. It ran around for about 9 hours, just harassing the shit out of the Germans. It destroyed a balloon, it destroyed some artillery, and eventually was hit by a shell. It was able to go for so long because it did have extra cans of fuel on the outside, but unfortunately a couple of them did get shot, and while they didn't immediately explode, the fumes did make the crew rather noxious. Luckily they did have gas masks, so they used those. When it was all over, when it was finally hit by a shell and on fire, the crew all escaped. Unfortunately, the driver was shot exiting by the Germans, and while the enlisted were perfectly happy to beat up and probably kill the commander and gunner, a German officer intervened to save their lives because, well, even though they'd taken a big toll on the Germans, they were just doing their duty. So they would both survive the war, although in a POW camp. Another famous one is Kaiser II on August 29. Not so much for the tank itself, but its commander. He would get out of the tank to save the lives of a fellow Whippet crew, and then also save the life of his own driver. But unfortunately, he was wounded multiple times and would not survive. But he would become one of only 4 to receive 4 tankers, I should say, to receive the Victoria Cross during World War I, even though it was posthumously. There have been other Whippets of note, but they would continue to play a major role as the trench warfare stagnation kind of discontinued itself and the Allies started to move around more. This was quite the scourge of the German army and was credited with kind of annoying a lot of them. The British hoped to actually have 5 battalions of these, each with about 36 tanks, so about 180 total. But they never got there. They only ever had 2, each with 48 tanks at the maximum, so about half of that. The reason was they built these, the losses were also high because, yeah, it doesn't have a lot of armor, and it's just armed with machine guns. And at that time, tanks were just, plus they were very difficult to drive and what have you. Now, the machine gun thing is quite interesting. You would think just having a turret would be better. And in some ways, it is, but in other ways, these guns can fire up to 4 different directions, although you'd never really have 4 people in there to fire them. But you could fire multiple guns at once, whereas with a turret, you can only point one direction and thus fire one direction. So that is an advantage to not doing the turret setup. And for its role, this was not going to stand up well against other armor, but against infantry, the armor was fine, and therefore, too, just using 303 machine guns was fine. Although it has to be said the Hotchkiss gun it was fitted with, while it was a standard for a lot of vehicles, it was known to jam and overheat. But then again, this is early days of, well, machine guns and tanks and everything, so they're still kind of ironing out the kinks. So a number were lost, and it never probably really reached its full potential. But then again, it did pretty good, honestly. In April of 1918, William Trenton himself would go to the front after this had been used for a little while to see what the soldiers thought of it. And yeah, they liked the range, they liked the speed, but they did not like the very cramped interior. Now, unlike the Mark I, Mark IV, and certainly Mark V, this was relatively well ventilated. Unfortunately, the way it was arranged with the engines up front and the way the exhaust worked, a lot of the exhaust would get sucked in or drawn in to the cabin. That's not good from the engine. Plus, if you have 4 machine guns, they have fumes and exhaust. So there was a fume problem. There's also a heat problem from the engines and the fact that it's a metal box with 3 guys, maybe 4 guys crammed in there very tight. So they got hot very quickly. And again, the ergonomics sucked. The turret area was very tight, restrictive, and the driver had just a lot of stress to try to manipulate shifts and wheels and pedals and gears and not damage the tank. The engines could very easily overheat, stall out, and the tracks could very easily be thrown or otherwise break on them, and then what are you going to do? And this did not carry a ditching bar like the Mark IV and Mark V could, although sometimes they would carry a stowage box on the outside so that the crew could put extra weapons or food or just water in there. Another interesting trick, they would usually have 2 crews sharing 1 tank. That way they could do on-off. One crew one day, then rest up, the other crew doing it. And so you often had 6 men operating 1 Whippet tank, so they had a day to recover and rest up. And it makes a lot of sense, especially considering the tanks themselves were only available in relatively limited numbers, and drivers really had to develop a skill for these. So, yeah. Interesting ways they dealt with them. In some ways, they had the exact same problem of pretty much all early tanks, frankly. They were all cramped, and the engines were there and exposed, and yeah, and the armor was not very thick on any of these early tanks, even the Mark V, which was up to about 16 millimeters, so not quite an inch and a quarter, excuse me, not quite 3/4 of an inch, about 2/3 of an inch of it, yeah. But interesting where we're at here, what this is kind of showing as far as British doctrine. And it would continue post-war, for a brief time at least. While production of later Whippets was supposed to happen in 1919, after the initial order of 200 Mark.As was completed, that was it. I think some were sent back to the factory and refurbished, reworked, repaired, and these were being turned out until about March of 1919. That's because after the war in Europe, 17 of these were sent with the British force to Russia to intervene in the civil war between the whites and the reds. Some of these were commanded by Brits, some of them ended up being commanded by white Russians. And of the 17, 12 were captured by the Reds, and these were redeployed within the Red Army in the 1920s. And they would study the Whippet for their own purposes. Likewise, in 1919, Britain would deploy up to 16 of these in Northern Ireland. This was a time for a lot of Irish rebellion. Some might say terrorists, some might say freedom fighters. Either way, the British were not pleased with the events. So they were mostly used to show the flag. An armored vehicle with up to 4 machine guns poking out usually takes the fight out of a lot of civilians. And they would stay in Northern Ireland, running patrols and being in parades, up until about 1922. The British also considered sending some Whippets down to Palestine, which they were in control of at this time, but ultimately decided not to. And at least one would be exported to South Africa. It was nominally there to be a war memorial, but it actually ended up being used to quell a couple of things before becoming a memorial. And for me, another interesting thing, Japan. While they actually did acquire a Mark IV in 1918, between 1919 and 1921, they acquired 6 Whippets, and these were technically the first tanks to go into actual military service with the Japanese Army. Now, they wouldn't serve in front line for too long, but they let them begin to learn tank doctrine. Eventually, they would opt for the French Renault FT, and then later versions of it. And and then they would begin domestic tank design and production at the end of 1920s. That said, once in a while, a Japanese-controlled Whippet would turn up in like Manchuria, and we're still at least a couple technically around by the time of the war in the Pacific, although they were officially out of service. The Japanese would also replace the 303 machine guns with their own 8mm Mauser types that they were using in the 1920s. This is before the 7.7 was around. I would imagine some 6.5 machine guns could have been put in them as well, because again, it's just a ball mount. Any machine gun that'll fit the firing port will go. And so that was kind of the post-war use. Most of them would ultimately be scrapped in the UK. They would also sell or trade some off to allies. They even tried selling a couple to Romania, although this never went through. It seems like by around 1927, they were out of service and soon would be declared obsolete. However, you know, that was the end of this design, the Mark.A, but it really did influence British tank doctrine going through World War II. So let's kind of end there. Sorry for not having an actual Renault FT from World War I to show you. Wings of the Great War has made these in the past, but I have not found one, and they haven't produced one in a while, so my T18 will have to do until I do find one. But it gives you a basic size idea. The FT could be armed with a machine gun or a 37mm cannon and a machine gun, and again, it was quite frankly the first tank to go into mass production that had a rotating turret, but it only had a crew of 2, and actually was slower than the Whippet. So yeah, for England's part, even though they had a couple of dozen FTs, they stuck to the size here 14 tons and size here of about 30 tons, having a medium and a heavy, which would evolve into their cruiser tank and their infantry tanks that we start to see in the 1930s. Things like the Churchill and the Crusader. That idea of having a relatively lightly armed and armored fast tank and a relatively slow but better armed and armored heavy tank. And this would continue until ultimately the Comet would turn into the Centurion and the dawn of the main battle tank, which was mostly based on something like the Whippet, but upgunned like the heavy tank. So, combination of the two. But I do think this does show the two parallel complementary tank classes that England developed in World War I and would use effectively through World War II and even into Korea a little bit. And the light tank series would continue in other ways. France would develop the FT, and this would influence American and Japanese tanks especially, also Russian tanks, although the light tank never quite took hold in England as it did in some other places. And of course these influenced Germany as well. Like I said, they had up to about 40 captured Mark IVs that they would redeploy. They never really did that with the Whippet. They would capture about 15, but only 2 were in working order. The other ones were damaged in some way, so they only used these for testing. But again, the Mark IV they would reintroduce for themselves. But yeah, I like the Whippet design. It's quite interesting, and so even though this one, like I said, does have a little bit of damage, it's at least in a spot that doesn't bug me, and it's a good way to show you this, and it works really well alongside my later 172 scale diecast British tanks. So, wanted to give you a nice video on this. I hope you enjoyed it. Hope everyone's doing okay as we move into April. With that, if you could, please do like, share, and subscribe. This is Misha, and I will catch you very soon next time.